Good morning. Thank you for being with us again. And thanks also to Father Brent and Bob Publicover for their technical support. And many thanks to Lorna, who, on top of all the playing that she does, has done an immense amount of research on the internet, especially with the acquisition of facsimiles and recent articles. So I'm grateful to all of you. As we said last week, we started this project with a question. How did the 11 Advent hymns we plan to explore end up in the Hymnal 1982? Where did the words come from? Where did the music come from? How and when were the words and the music joined together? Last week, we covered two Advent hymns rooted in Latin chant, Creator of the Stars of Night and O Come, Emmanuel. This week, we move on to explore two hymns from the 16th century psalm and psalm tune tradition. Hymn 67, Comfort, Comfort Ye, My People, and hymn 258, Virgin Born, We Bow Before Thee. The Hymnal 1982, by the way, is the first Episcopal hymnal to include these two hymns. We began last Wednesday with the definition of a hymn, excuse me, a poem of praise to God designed to be sung. Our beginning definition today is a bit simpler. We all know what a psalm is. We know that there are 150 of them in the book of Psalms, and that this book is called the Psalter. Psalm singing has remained central to Christian worship as it was and is in the Judaic worship out of which Christian worship sprang. So clearly a psalm is different from a hymn in that the words are biblical, an aspect very important to the 16th century Protestant reformers' approach to worship. For the most part, however, these performers rejected prose psalmody, preferring metrical psalmody. That is, psalms arranged like hymns in strophic form with rhyme and poetic meter. These metrical psalms followed the pattern of popular songs of the day. In fact, the vast majority of English metrical psalms are in a pattern, a syllable count 8-6-8-6, and rhyme A-B-A-B, which is called the Old English ballad meter. So that tells you something about where it came from. Our discussion of metrical psalmody begins of necessity with the French reformer and theologian Jean Calvin, known to us as John Calvin, who, as a young pastor in Strasbourg, published in 1539 a songbook for his congregation containing 19 metrical psalms, 6 of his own, and the rest by Clément Marot, a renowned French poet at the court of François Ier, who eventually had to flee France because of his presumed heretical leanings. Calvin soon concluded that despite his own linguistic skills, which were considerable, producing metrical psalmody in French was not his forte. So he turned to real poets to do the job. You have there, thanks to Father Brent, you have visual 1. This is the title page of the 1539 Psalter. In other words, Calvin's first Psalter. And it says there, some psalms and songs put to music. The Cantique seem to have been the Song of Simeon, the Nunc Dimittis, the Creed, and the Ten Commandments. We don't know what the tunes were, but it is assumed that they were German tunes being used in Strasbourg. After Calvin moved to Geneva a couple of years later, he engaged French composers to write tunes. The most prominent one being Louis Bourgeois. Later in Geneva, Calvin developed a form of worship in which metrical psalmody was central. Calvin believed that the Psalms and the Canticles of the Old and New Testaments were the only texts worthy of being sung to God in worship, and this singing was to be unaccompanied and in unison. The preferred range of the melody was an octave, with the note values restricted to two values, what we would call half notes and quarter notes. The final note would be longer, a double half note. Only in psalters for home use was a simple chordal texture allowed. In his preface to the Genevan Psalter of 1543, Calvin expresses both his awareness of the power of music and his mistrust of its use in public worship. And I quote, "Let the world have the good sense henceforth to leave off singing those songs in part vain and frivolous, in part stupid and dull, in part foul and vile, and in consequence evil and destructive, which it has availed itself of up to now, and to use these divine and heavenly canticles with good King David. As for the melody, it has seemed best to moderate it in the way we have done, so as to lend it the gravity and majesty that befits its subject, and as might even be suitable for singing in church." End of quote. The English church was also skeptical about music. Witness the first page, moving on to visual 2, the first page of a 1584 printing of the so-called old version, the Starnold and Hopkins Psalter of 1562, which was the first complete English Psalter. This says, and you probably, I don't know that you can read it with the old type, but it says, "The whole book of Psalms, collected into English meter by T. Starnold, W. Whittingham, J. Hopkins, and others, conferred with the Hebrew, with apt notes to sing them withal, newly set forth and allowed to be sung of all the people together in all churches, before and after morning and evening prayer, as also before and after the sermons, and moreover in private houses, for their godly solace and comfort, laying apart all ungodly songs and ballads, which tend only to the nourishing of vice and corrupting of youth." The tunes of these two hymns we're discussing today are from the French Genevan tradition, but in order to explore metrical psalmody, we're going to use some examples in English to avoid grappling any more than necessary with the French texts. The first issue to be faced was translating the text. This you probably can read. This is Psalm 121 in Miles Coverdale's 1535 translation. So that's very early in terms of Reformation. Despite its traditional language, this psalm may seem familiar to you, since it is close in rhythm and text to what we have in our prayer book today. Indeed, Coverdale's Psalter became that of the first Book of Common Prayer, 1549. You probably noticed that if you compare the Psalms with, say, the King James Version, you realize that ours are different. The successive prayer books have maintained that tradition of using Coverdale's Psalms. However, since Coverdale did not go directly to the Hebrew, his Psalms were translated from an old Latin version, which was based on the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew original. In other words, it went through several stages. Many small changes have been based directly on the Hebrew, have been made over the years. in Coverdale's Psalter. I don't need to read that, I guess. No, everyone, if you can see that, you'll recognize it very close to what's in the prayer book for Psalm 121. Here is Psalm 121 from the old version, 1562, Starnold and Hopkins Complete Psalter. As you can see, it doesn't fare very well in metrical rhymed verse. On the left, you have the metrical translation by William Whittingham. And on the right, that's just the facsimile how it actually appeared in the Psalter. Let me just read this in case you can't read it yourselves. I lift my eyes to Zion Hill, from whence I do attend, till succor God me send. The mighty God me succor will, which heaven and earth did frame, and all things therein name. Thy foot from slip he will preserve, and will thee safely keep, for he doth never sleep. Lo, he that Israel doth conserve, sleep never can surprise, nor slumber close his eyes. The Lord thy keeper is always, on thy right hand is he, a shade to cover thee. The sun shall not thee parch by day, nor moon scarce half so bright, with cold thee hurt by night. The Lord will keep thee from distress, and will thy life sure save. Yea, thou shalt also have in all thy business good success. When thou goest in or out, he'll compass thee about. There was a lot of controversy, and you can see why, about these terrible translations. The Earl of Rochester famously framed his critique in satirical verse, and I quote, Starnold and Hopkins had great qualms when they translated David's Psalms to make the heart full glad. But had it been poor David's fate to hear thee sing and they translate, by God, 'twould have made him mad. Nevertheless, end of quote, yes. Nevertheless, it was only in 1696, that's 134 years later, that a new improved Psalter was produced, the new version of the Psalms of David by Brady and Tate, who was Nahum Tate was the poet laureate. Indeed, of better quality, but the old version lived on and was beloved by many people. To talk about tunes, we thought we'd look at Dundee, a familiar and beautiful tune from the Scottish Psalter of 1615. This appears in our hymnal with three different hymns, three different texts. We'll use, for our example, hymn 709, Oh God of Bethel. You'll notice, if you can see this, that the pattern of the French tunes with the octave range and half and quarter note pattern, which I described earlier. In England, the persecution of Protestants under the Catholic Queen Mary, you know, Bloody Mary, forced many to flee to Geneva, to other places in France and other places on the continent where they encountered French psalm singing. This meant that many English psalms ended up being sung to French tunes, and that the Genevan tunes metric structure influenced tunes written in England and Scotland. This text is not a metrical psalm, do understand, but a hymn by an early 18th century hymn writer. So I guess we're going to sing, Lorna and I will sing the first verse of this in unison, as it would have been. In 1615. Right. Okay. O God of Bethel, by whose hand thy people still are fed, oh, through this earthly pilgrimage, hast all thine Israel led. Now, when you look down the page, you'll notice that the other version in our hymnal at 709 has the melody in the tenor. Let me explain a little about that. From the beginnings of polyphony, way back in the 10th century or so, that is to say, music with more than one line, more than one part, the tenor, a term which comes from the Latin verb tenere, meaning to hold. You all know what tenacious means, yeah, from tenere, to hold, held the principal melody, usually a piece of melody from chant. Eventually, other parts were added as textures increased. We'll say more about that later on. For now, though, I will sing the melody again as the tenor part while Lorna plays the other parts. I guess I'm going to sing verse 5. Yeah, I'll sing verse 5 and Lorna will play the other parts. Okay. Such blessings from thy gracious hand our humble prayers implore, and thou shalt be our covenant God and a portion evermore. Okay, now it's time to move on to the Genevan Psalter from which our tunes for today come. We'll use Psalm 42, which gives us the music of hymn 67, Comfort Ye My People, to explain most aspects of Genevan metrical psalmody. Later on, we'll touch briefly on Psalm 86, which gives us the music of the lovely Marian hymn, 258, Virgin born, we bow before thee. Concerning this music, there is speculation among scholars that some psalm tunes were based on particular secular songs, secular chansons, but it seems more likely, to me anyway, that the psalm tunes were influenced by the general style of secular music of the day, rather than that tunes were based on a particular tune would be based on a particular secular song. Okay.
It did happen, in which we'll talk about next week.
Yeah, it does occasionally happen. This is visual 6, and it is the title page of a 1560 edition edited by a man named Pierre Davantes, who may have written some of the music too, we don't know. Anyway, this is an 83 psalm, not complete, but 83 of the psalms, a Genevan Psalter, first published in 1551. So this is a later printing of the same thing. The goal seems to have been to have the people learn these 83 psalms first, before publication of the complete Psalter, which did happen soon thereafter, 1562. The French basically translates what you've got there, Psalms of David put in French rhyme by Clément Marot and Théodore de Bèze, talk about him later, with a new and easy method for singing each verse of the psalm without going back to the first, according to the customary singing in the church, expressed by a compendium of notes, of notes set forth in the preface by the author himself. Visual 7 shows Psalm 42 with the tune to which we sing hymn 67, Comfort, Comfort Ye My People. Here's the beginning of Psalm 42, which you will recognize from the Book of Common Prayer. As the deer longs for the water brooks, so longs my soul for you, O God. My soul is athirst for God, athirst for the living God. You'll notice the Latin title there, 3 lines down from the top. And then below that, the regular prose psalm text in the margins. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, the prose text is in the margins, And you'll see it starts with that big letter C there on the left. Yeah, that's where the psalm, this particular Psalm 42 starts. It's under the notes is the metrical version. And then there are names on the notes, which we'll come to in a moment, and little numbers underneath. The little numbers are part of Advent2's special system, and we're not quite sure what they mean. Anyway, you notice that on the notes themselves, for the notes themselves, he's added psalmization syllables equivalent to our do, re, mi, you know. Do, a deer, a female deer, re, a golden sun, right? Me, a name I call myself, and so forth. So we all know what do, re, mi is anyway. But what is amazing to me is that this complicated score is what those sturdy Calvinists were actually singing from. Makes our hymnal look pretty simple. We're going to digress a little bit. Miragistorum. Each phrase starts a note higher. The first syllable is ut, and that got changed a little later. In fact, this is a funny story. The ut, which is admittedly not a very beautiful syllable to sing, ut, got changed in the early 17th century by a man named Giovanni Battista Doni. Got changed to do. Maybe he thought that what was ugly, which it is, but why change it to do? And one thinks maybe because D and O were the first two letters of his own name. I don't know. Anyway, we're going to sing this hymn, I guess.
And we should say that Guido was trying, this was a way of trying to teach people to read music.
Yes.
So the do, re, mi's,
Yeah.
which are still used today.
Which are still used. A lot of you, yeah, some of you may have grown up with do, re, mi. Okay.
They only
Yeah,
got as far as la, and that's another.
And that's a good question. Yeah, we'll come to that in a
Well,
moment.
we
Yeah,
get,
yeah.
somewhere along, because
What happened
it
to?
was called the hexachord, but it's too complicated.
Yeah, well.
Okay,
Okay.
we ready?
Yep.
Okay.
Utque ant laxis resonare fibris mira gestorum famuli tuorum solre polluti labi realtum Sancte Johannes. So there you have it. Ut, re, mi, so, fa.
And some woman in the 1900s sort of was involved in, some English woman was involved in fixing this up, and so it went as far up the scale.
Yes.
I can't remember her
Brent
name.
has pointed out that you only have 6 of these. You have what they call a hexachord, 6 notes. So it fell to later generations who complete this. What they did in the time we're talking about, was to start all over again. In fact, we'll show you an example of how that works. They would overlap, interlock the hexachords in order to get enough notes. Okay, we're moving on now, I guess, Brent,
And the
to
last thing, because it did have to do with the half and the spaces.
yes,
Whether it was
yeah,
a whole note or a half note.
right, the half step. You
Half
mean, yeah,
step, I mean.
yeah. The half step is between mi and fa. So if they wanted a half step,
Right.
and you'll see that in a moment, they would go to another hexachord. Okay, so this is visual 9. This is an enlargement of something you've already seen, namely 2 visuals ago, visual 7. The melody is very clearer now because it's larger, even though the notes are diamond shaped and not round, which is what we're used to, or square, what we learned about last week. These stemless notes are what we could call half notes, and the diamonds with the stems on them could consider the quarter notes. Advent2, the editor, is using fixed do, meaning that do, re, mi, or ut, re, mi, and so forth, denote fixed pitches. In this example, the melody starts on F, as you can see there, fa, Okay. Now, do you want to sing it now or?
No. Let's keep going.
Yeah, I want to just explain a little bit about the 6 syllables that Brent asked about. There are only 6 syllables because this is a hexachord. That's as far as Guido went. So when Devantes ran out in this example, and you'll see where that is, it's in the 1, 2, 3, 4th staff down. He went over the edge, as it were, and he presumably did that in order to get the half step he needed. We'll sing this melody, I hope.
We hope so.
With fa sol la, but the text is, just remember what we're singing. It's metricized French for "As the deer longs for the water brooks, so longs my soul for you, oh God." So we'll sing some of this melody.
And I should say that Devantes had this an 18-page preface in this book explaining this whole thing.
Explaining his system.
I couldn't plow through even with my French in that old script. So
Makes you wonder if it was worth it. Anyway, okay, here we go.
We're gonna try to do this right.
We'll try to do this, okay? Fa, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ut. Fa, sol, la, fa, fa, sol, fa. Fa, sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re, ut. Fa, sol, la, sol, la. Mi, sol, fa, mi, re, mi. Sol, la, sol, fa, mi, re. Mi, sol, fa, mi, ut, re, mi, ut. That goes on mi, fa, la, sol, fa, mi, fa, mi. Yeah, that's cut off here, but you get the idea of how the psalmization syllables went and why. Yes, Brent.
Where would these be used? Because this is Genevan?
This is the Calvinist singing in Geneva from this book.
Believe it or not.
1560.
Or just home devotions?
No, everybody in church.
In church.
Yeah,
This is their hymnal.
this
is their hymnal.
unison, just one line.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard to imagine singing.
But
Singing
the
from this,
French,
but the
French
French
words
is
are very
there.
clear.
Oh, the French is there, yes.
La biche, blah, 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 okay.
Yeah, they would have sung of course, the French. They wouldn't have sung Do Re Mi except to learn.
That was to help,
That
was presumably to learn
to learn
music.
the
And they
music,
knew that
right?
they must have learned that in these singing schools. That was an interesting thing that came up, is that this guy Guillaume Franck in Geneva had singing schools for the children.
So
they were
like what?
big- They were big into
Yeah.
learning to sing.
Sort of like what
Congregational
happened.
singing.
What happened in America
That's right,
later
the
on?
singing schools.
Yeah, the singing schools.
And these numbers here above the French, that's the thing we don't know.
I'm
I'd
not
have to
quite.
read the
I'm
18
not quite sure. I'd have to read his 18 pages to find out. I don't really know.
They seem to be another part of his code to help.
You can see how much
Yeah,
more is it?
So what happened?
6, 7,
Yeah.
8, 7, 6, 5,
Right.
4.
What happened when he went to the next verse was, instead of having to go back and flip your page back, he kept the text going. But
Yeah.
it didn't have any music, and now it just had the little numbers underneath. So the little
So-
numbers were some kind of a clue
Yeah.
to people.
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
I-
that must be true.
I tried to decode it. I looked at
Yeah.
it briefly. I thought, nah,
Yeah,
life is too short.
life is too short.
Melody is
Thank you.
going forward.
Yep.
We know this melody. We sang it in church on Sunday in the choir.
Okay, visual 10 is the title page of Claude Gudimel. He's another composer. Claude Gudimel's 1565, you can see that at the bottom there, publication of the Psalter, mise en musique à 4 parties, in other words, put to music in 4 parts. That warrior there with the sword and shield, I suppose, is a 16th century version of King David.
So to me, it looks more like a Roman centurion. I don't
Yeah,
know.
right.
It's
Yeah.
not-
I doubt that David ever looked like that. But anyway, Gudimel makes it very clear in his preface that, quote, "We have added to the melody of the psalm 3 parts, not to introduce singing them in church." You remember Calvin forbade that. but to glorify God at home. In other words, these 4-part settings were for home use. We'll look more closely at Gudimel and his 4-part setting at the very end of our presentation this morning. That melody and Gudimel's harmonization made their way to Germany through a man named Ambrosius Lobwasser. In 1573, Lobwasser published a German translation of the French Genevan Psalter. In Germany, this original melody, with its catchy mixture of triple and duple feeling, ta ta ti ta ta tum pum 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 pa ti tum pum pum. Anyway, that tune began to be evened out, and Lorna will demonstrate that momentarily, both in triple meter and quadruple meter or duple meter. Okay, so that's the cover of Gudimel's 4-part edition. Now I guess we can move on. Now this is the great evening out, like the great resignation. This is the great evening out of those wonderfully catchy rhythms. In Germany, Freu dich sehr, if you can read that, it's what it says there at the top. Freu dich sehr, o meine Seele, is actually a funeral text, became attached to this tune, translated, which you don't have there, rejoice greatly, O my soul, and forget all misery and torment, since Christ your Lord calls you from this valley of misery. From affliction and sorrow, you will journey to the joy no ear has ever heard that awaits you in eternity. Well, that's the end. That's all I will quote for the moment. And what you have on the page, excuse me, are some examples from Bach Cantatas of this tune. Bach incorporated these chorales. He apparently liked this tune from earlier sources. And you probably can't read the dates, but it's 1620, 1641, and 1647. And he incorporated them into cantatas, which he was writing in the early half of the 18th century, early 1700s. Go ahead. Lorna's going to play now some these leavened out rhythmic versions. Before she does, though, let me just notice this chorale is in what they call bar form, A, B. So the first section repeats. It's very common with German chorales. But Lorna's going to save time by leaving out the second of the Stollen of the A's.
So this is the first one in 3. It is close to the old rhythm, but not quite. And then this B form. The next one's still in 3, but we're now getting into a kind of a waltzy feeling. And the second part. And then we go to 4/4, but it still has a little irregularity. And the second part. into regular quarter notes. And the second part.
Okay, now visual 12. Let me explain just a little bit about this. In 1671, a man named Olearius wrote the text Tristet meine Lieben, from which our text at hymn 67 comes. Console those I love, console my people, says my God. Console those who are now distressed by their enemies' scorn and contempt. Since Jerusalem fares well by this, speak to her in a friendly way, for her suffering is over. I bring to an end her time of service in war. And that's the end of the text.
Well, there's a lot more.
Yeah, no, but I'm just saying, that's all I'm reading this morning. Okay, somewhere along the way, this text became associated with the Genevan Psalter tune for Psalm 42. So you've got a kind of mixture of German and French going on here. We don't know that the tune, which is generally referred to as Fröhlich Sehe or Meine Seele in Germany, and this text, Tristet meine Lieben, appeared in Bach's Cantata 30. We do know that I can't read my own writing. We do know that tune, the tune and text appeared together in Bach's Cantata 30, which was a cantata for the feast of St. John the Evangelist in 1738. Okay, let's move on to visual 13, which makes things a little clearer. Yeah, visual, let me just say a little bit about this. Visual 13 shows the Bach that you just saw, but now at the bottom of the on the right-hand side of the visual. The harmony is very sophisticated, characteristic of Bach's chorales, and a far cry from the block chords of Gudimel's harmonization, which you see on the rest of the page, starting on the left. And this, yeah, I guess that's all I want to say.
Gudimel, the melody was in the tenor, but this is a.
Oh, right.
This was published in France in 1879, where they transferred for a French ensemble, a hymn book, where they put all the melodies.
Right. The melody.
And they switched the other parts around.
That's right. Good. Yeah, the melody is now in the soprano.
This is Gudimel. We're going to play Gudimel's piece, and then Bach.
And then Bach. Right. Okay. That's Gudimel, and now Bach.
Oh, good old Bach.
Good old Bach.
This is an entirely different animal. 18th century.
So Bach may have evened out the rhythms, but he certainly souped up the harmonies, typical Bach fashion. By the way, this melody, with a translation from the German into English, appeared in Catherine Winkworth's Chorale Book for England in 1863. You probably heard of Catherine Winkworth because she did a lot of German. She lived in Germany, knew the language very well, made a lot of translations from German into English. From there, it made its way, thanks partly to its popularity in the Lutheran Church, into our own hymnal. Okay, guess what? At last, yeah, we've gotten to hymn 67 in our hymnal. This hymn, by the way, is always recommended for Advent2. And in fact, we sang it last Sunday as a hymn during communion. The choir, that is, sang it. It's recommended for Advent2 in all 3 of the liturgical years in the cycle. It is in unison here with the same rhythm as the original 1551 and 1562 melody. So in that sense, we've sort of come full circle.
Basically the same harmonization of
Yeah, and Gudimel's harmonization. So we've come back to where we started.
Verse
Okay.
1. Okay, here we go.
Verse 1. Okay. Comfort, comfort ye my people. Speak ye peace, thus saith our God. Comfort those who sit in darkness, mourning beneath their sorrows alone. Speak ye to Jerusalem of the peace that waits for them. Tell her that her sins I cover, and her warfare now is over. Okay. I hope you were able to join in from wherever you are in singing singing that. Our second hymn, hymn 258, Virgin Born, We Bow Before Thee, is often suggested for Advent 4 because, as you remember, Advent 4 has an emphasis on Mary. Here is Psalm 86 from Devantis 1560 publication, which we've looked at before. This has only the melody, because remember, that's all it was that Calvin wanted people to sing in church. Excuse me. The psalm here is, bow down your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and in misery. Keep watch over my life, for I am faithful. Save your servant who puts his trust in you. To give you a flavor of what this might have sounded like, something like what it would have sounded like in 1560, we're going to again try to sing this we'll sing it in French. Mon Dieu, prête-moi l'oreille.
Just a verse.
Just one verse.
And it says that it starts on Re.
Oh, right, you can see that. Yeah. See that, Ray? Okay.
So we're going to sing it there.
Okay, here we go. Mon Dieu, prête-moi l'oreille, dans ma douleur sans pareille, pour la misère où je suis, et soulage mes ennuis. Seigneur, garantis ma vie, à te plaire mon envie, sauve ô Dieu, ton serviteur, qui s'assure en ta faveur.
There we are, Calvinists.
Yeah, here we are, French Calvinists.
All right.
Okay. Visual 16, moving on, having survived that. Moving on to visual 16, we have, yes. This is the same psalm from Gudimel's 1565 publication of the entire Psalter. And you remember he said in his preface, sort of apologizing for the other parts, we have added to the melody of the psalm 3 parts, not to introduce singing them in church, but to glorify God at home. For the vast majority of Gudimel's harmonizations, in fact, the melody is in the tenor. It's interesting that this psalm was one of the very few where Gudimel himself put the melody in what we call the soprano. In this manuscript, if you can read there in the upper left, it's called super, which is short for superius, from the Latin super, meaning above. When we sang Dundee, we talked about the tenor holding, from tenere, the tenor holding the melody. Now, what are these other parts? Over on the right, you see he says contra. The contra is short for contratenor altus, and I think this is interesting. Contratenor altus got translated and contracted in our language to contralto, a fancy term for an alto. Okay, so that's where contralto comes from, contratenor, in other words, a part written against the tenor, but above it. And you may have wondered why a person with a low voice would be called contratenor above, high, but that's where it comes from in the Latin. It's the melody against the tenor, but above it, but not as high as the super, the superius. Now, on the lower right, you see he says bassus. You can guess what that is. That's short for contratenor bassus. In other words, the melody added against the tenor. This all started back in the, 15th century when 4-part texture became common. Contratenor bassus was the melody against the tenor, but below it, okay, where the contratenor altus was above it. And this, yes, this is where we get our familiar terms, SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Okay, I hope you found that as interesting as I do, even if you, whether you sing in a choir or not. Okay, moving on here, yes. Now we have visual 17. Thank you. This visual shows the first publication of the text, Virgin born. We're talking about the words now. Virgin born, we bow before thee. You'll remember that from last week, the word hymn denotes the words. This is another, like the only hymns, this is another volume of hymns with no music. Published posthumously in New York in 1827, it was the work of the Right Reverend Reginald Heber, Bishop of Calcutta. Notice that Heber appointed it, and says right at the top of the second page, for the 3rd Sunday in Lent. His idea, which we take for granted now, but his idea was that hymnals should be arranged according to the liturgical year. So that really is not as ancient an idea as you might expect. Okay, and then we can go on to visual 18. Now, this is an interesting example. The English hymnal of 1906 was a distinguished hymnal, came later than Hymns Ancient and Modern, which we talked about. They thought that they could improve in some ways upon Hymns Ancient and Modern. The musical editor was no less than Ralph Vaughan Williams himself. And when Lorna plays this, you will see how tremendously different it is from Gudimel's version. And with this harmonization, again, Ralph Vaughan Williams apparently conceived of this as a processional. You can see
For a Marian feast.
yeah, for a Marian feast. You can see it says processional there. It's in that section of the English hymnal. So Lorna's going to play this, and
First, I'm going to play the Goodie
Okay.
and no, it's not there. I'm going to play the Gudimel harmonization.
Okay.
That came out of the 1565 book.
okay, just for contrast.
Sorry about that. That's in a different key from the hymnal.
And now,
Here's Vaughan Williams.
Ralph
Okay.
Vaughan Williams.
And notice there is a very juicy, there are lots of running notes in the bass. There's a very juicy chord at the top of the second page.
One particularly.
Called a
It's
Neapolitan.
called a Neapolitan if you know harmony.
Okay.
Here comes the Neapolitan. A rather different conception of the piece from,
And final. Right.
right. Okay, the end is in sight, folks. At last, we move now to our last visual 19. And this is familiar. This is right out of our hymnal, 1982. As I said at the outset, this is the first time that this text and tune appear in an Episcopal hymnal, of which there have been several over the years. Note that the straightforward harmonization is very close to what Lorna played, the Gudimel from 1565. So we end our presentation this morning by singing a verse of this beautiful, beautiful hymn. Please sing along if you wish. Virgin born, we bow before thee. Blessed was the womb that bore thee. Mary, Mother meek and mild, blessed was she in her child. Blessed was the breast that fed
is a noble tune.
I hope that Bishop Heber would forgive us for doing only the first part of his
That's
poem,
all right.
of his hymn. But anyway,
Okay,
we're
that's-
coming up, we're run past 11, so,
So you had a few little extra blah, blahs, but that's all right.
okay. Okay, so
Terrific.
that's it. Thank you very much, and thanks to the crew and to the
Thank you.
audience. Okay, God bless. Bye-bye.